Hey guys, thanks for tuning in today. I want to talk about a subject that I find pretty interesting. The fact that bass can hear you. And, we don't stop to think about that sometimes. And often when we're out and we're fishing, we're making noise and we're wondering why we're not catching anything. Could very well be because the noise that we're making scares the fish away. Uh, Fish aren't necessarily listening to us bullshit with our partners, but they do hear the sounds that we make while we're in a boat. And I remember back years ago when we used to fish out of aluminum boats in particular. It didn't take much. You could move a tackle box, you could just shuffle your feet or even set a thermos down. But that clanking sound against, metal on metal, would send those vibrations through the water column and could often spook a fish. Um, I can remember many times fishing as a guide down here in Florida where I would be out, maybe I'd have a father and his son or a couple of guys going with me, and we'd be out flipping a patch of reeds or flipping some pads. And it always struck me as a little odd that, I could flip in and that bait would hit the water, make a little bit of a splash. And a lot of times, within, no time, I'd get a strike. I'd get a pickup. And I always believed that it had something to do with the sound that lure made when it hit the water. Now, since then, I've had other people tell me that their goal is to get the bait into the water as silently as they can. And I got to tell you, I disagree with that. I think hearing is critically important when it comes to bass fishing because uh, a bass hears your bait. And, depending on the clarity of the water, he may not see it, but he'll hear it. And, I know that they have a lateral line and they're supposedly able to hear things in a different way than we do, but they do hear. And many times, I've seen the longer that I leave a bait in the water, the more often a fish will find it. And they'll find it because they heard the sound and they hone in on that sound. I'll give you a great example. A number of times when I've been fishing, uh, I'll have somebody right alongside of me up in the front of the boat. And as we're going along and we're flipping, they're flipping a bait right behind me. Might be the exact same bait, might be a different color, different size, different shape, but they're right behind me, a couple of feet. A lot of times, particularly if it's a father and son that I'm taking out or a young boy, I'll have them stand next to me because I know their chances are very good of catching a fish. And a lot of times that fish is the same fish that heard my bait, and my bait hit the water. I lifted my bait out and moved it to another spot. In the meantime, the kid or the person behind me flips in. The bass that came looking for my bait now sees their bait, and bingo, they've got a good fish on. I've seen that happen so many times, it's just amazing. And, I tend to put my bait exactly where I want it. I mean, I've been flipping and pitching long enough to know I can put it in those small little pockets. I can give it a couple of pops. I can take it out. And in no time, I'm covering a lot of territory. A lot of times, the people I'm fishing with, because they're new to this type of fishing, they're not moving their baits quite like I am. Matter of fact, I've noticed particularly with young guys, young boys, they're pretty much trying to follow me for the first 20 minutes, and then it's a matter of just dropping the bait over the side of the boat. They're getting tired, they're bored, they're not catching anything, so they're not paying a lot of attention. But again, what happens is I flip in, the bass hears my bait, least I believe this is what happens. I flip in, the bass hears my bait. They come looking for it. They can't find it. And as they look around the area, they see the kid's bait, and that's the bait they grab. So if you don't believe this, watch fish in an aquarium sometime. You know, when you drop a bait in, it makes a distinct noise, and the fish immediately runs. They immediately flee the area, but they don't go very far. You know, they go 5 feet, 10 feet, maybe not even that far. They just run away from it. But then they immediately turn around and come back. And the reason they do this is they're curious creatures to begin with, but they assume that it's food. And in most cases, it is. You know, a fish, an injured minnow, a shiner that's dying, that's up near the surface of the water and they're splashing, it'll attract attention. Usually, the first thing it does, depending on how loud the sound is, it'll force the fish to run a little bit and then come back. But they always come back. They come back because they want to see what caused that commotion, what made that sound. And if it's something they think will fit in their mouth, and because it moves, it must be alive, they're going to eat it. So keep that in mind when you think about, you know, bass fishing. Sound is critically important. The fish can hear you. And I'll give you another great example. Out in California, we've all heard about the big bass out there. I think 19 out of the top 20 big bass ever caught have been caught in California. And people assume, well, it must be the climate. You know, it's hard to say. It could be a lot of different factors. But I'm here to tell you it's one thing and one thing alone, and that is that the bass out in California, they eat a lot of trout. Trout is a natural fish to California. Bass is not. The bass have been, you know, planted out there. But the trout is natural, and they stock the lakes with trout. So there's a lot of food. And for the record, a bass is faster, can swim faster than a trout. So a trout is an easy meal for a largemouth bass. And because it's so high in protein, a bass can grow very quickly just eating trout. Now, what does hearing have to do with all that? Well, here's an example of how important hearing is out in California. For years, you know, they would bring the trout to different lakes in these big trucks. And these big trucks, they'd roll along and they'd come down some gravel road and pull right up to the edge of the water. And then they would literally use like a chute that they forced the fish out of into, you know, the lake. And after a while, some scuba divers were curious what actually takes place when all these fish are released. So they went down in the water and they watched, and they knew that based on the timeline for these trucks, they knew what time they were supposed to be there. And they noticed that 10 or 15 minutes before the trucks even got there, bass started to congregate in a particular area. As the time got closer to when the truck was supposed to be there, more and more bass joined in until they were just literally stacked up like cordwood. And eventually, the truck would stop and they'd start releasing the trout. And within seconds, there'd be a huge feeding spree. And these bass would just go crazy, gobbling up every small trout they could find. And you know, they're not stocking 5-pound trout. These are small fingerlings, sometimes a little bigger. But you know, one bass can eat a lot of them, and they did. And the scuba divers were just shocked. They had no idea that the bass were eating up all these trout every time the trucks came and delivered them. So long story short, they no longer, in the state of California, they no longer deliver trout with a truck because they know the bass can actually hear them. The bass can hear the trucks coming down the road miles before it even gets there. They feel the vibrations. But they've stopped doing that. Instead, they've gone to airplanes. And now it's not unusual to see a small plane, usually a plane that you might expect to be a crop duster, come down close to the water, and you'll see the spray coming out of the back of the plane, and they're literally dropping the trout in from, a relatively short distance. And the bass have no idea that they're being implanted that way. So there's a much higher rate of survival among the trout. But it's an interesting story when you think about it, because there's a reason these fish get so big out in California, and a lot of it has to do with trout. And at least for years, a lot of it had to do with the trout being released the way they were, and fish just going on literally a feeding spree and fattening up really fast. I can give you another example. In fact, I can think of half a dozen examples, but I have a fishing dock in my backyard. Uh, Short distance from the house, I've got a small lake. It's called Lake Clara. The lake actually is about 20 feet deep. It was probably dug out back in the time when they built the homes in this area. But I can't tell you how many times. Well, first of all, I started feeding the bluegill, and I'd go out with a bag of it was basically catfish food, floating catfish food. But I go out, just throw a couple handfuls out, and initially, no bluegills would really come in. But after a period of time of doing this, every night I'd go out, and I mean, I'd throw a couple handfuls of food. Those fish would just explode everywhere. And now, it's been, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years that I've been doing this, trying to do it almost every night. Now, before I even set foot on the dock, the fish are waiting for me. And I know they can see me. And I know as soon as I step on that dock, they move from the shoreline out to the front of the dock, and they're waiting for that food. And again, it's because they hear me. Yeah, they see me and they hear me. And that's what it's all about, folks. So the next time you're out fishing, and particularly if you're in the shoreline area and you're standing up in the boat, just remember that bass can probably see you if you can see him. So keep that in mind. They probably don't know what you are, but they can probably see you. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up, and love to have you subscribe to the channel. If you have any comments, please leave them below. Thanks, and I'll talk with you soon.